Is this music not a little bit too happy for a podcast about the recession?
I like the music. I think it's fun because it's a recession, but it's still fun.
Okay, we'll go with it.
Welcome to Money Matters. With the news of a technical recession, there's all sorts of figures flying around. But what do they really mean? We'll be breaking it down for you on today's show. So I'm joined with my co-hosts David.
Hi.
And Joe.
Good morning, everyone.
And we will also be hearing from a special guest, Professor Richard Murphy, who co-founded the Tax Justice Network, the Fair Tax Mark and Finance for the Future. He also co-created the Green New Deal, so it's fair to say he knows a lot about this topic. We also went to speak to local businesses on the Moor Market here in Sheffield to get their perspective.
So I want to make 5 promises to you today. 5 pledges to deliver peace of mind. We will grow the economy, creating better paid jobs and opportunity right across the country.
Having spent years in the slow lane, Rishi Sunak has now put our economy into reverse. This is Rishi's recession, and it is the British people who will pay the price.
So, what is a technical recession?
Well, a technical recession happens when the gross domestic product, GDP, contracts for 2 consecutive quarters, and GDP fell 0.1% in the third quarter of last year. So that's why we're in a technical recession. Really, we should be asking as well, like, what is GDP? What is it, these things that we're measuring? So gross domestic product is used as the main measure of UK economic growth based on the value of goods and services produced during a given month. So, but a lot of people say we shouldn't be focusing on GDP because that takes the nation as a whole and measures the growth. What we should be looking at is GDP per capita, which is the amount of growth per person. And if you look at the GDP per capita, it's not the size of the economy doesn't matter, but the amount of growth per person. And this has been falling for 2 years. And if we look at, in comparison to other countries in other areas, the US is at plus 6.5% at the moment, EU plus 2%, and the UK is minus 1%. So we're doing worse off than other places around the world right now.
Yeah, and that's a lot of numbers, a lot of useful numbers, and it's good to get our heads around them. I think it's important to say that this is, relatively speaking, a very mild recession, and should be short-lived. I think this is the smallest, I don't know if that's the correct economic word, but the smallest recession since the 1970s, I think, on paper. But it is important to think about the context of that as well. It's like we've only just recently come out of a recession with the COVID pandemic, which was like the largest recession by far. I think 9.9% the economy dropped in 2020. So already be entering back into a recession, I think, is indicative of like the general downward trend of this country's economy in the last decade, really.
Yeah, I get what you're saying with it being a technical recession and it being shallow, but I think it does depend how we look at it because, like I said, with the GDP per capita, it differs from the GDP as a whole. So we can say, yeah, we've just dipped into a technical recession, but those figures, if you take it per person, growth per person, it actually shows that we've been falling for 2 years.
Yeah.
So depending on how you look at it, it can be a more serious problem than you'd think. And I think from talking to people when we went to the Moor markets to speak to small business owners, what they were telling me is they are struggling, and whether that's import-export tax because of Brexit, whether that's rates going up because the rates in the Moor market are being put up in order to cover costs, which are obviously connected to cost of living and the recession.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think in the post-COVID landscape, there's always been kind of this pessimistic kind of attitude towards spending in general and towards the current economic climate. I think regardless of the figures, it's very clear that on the ground, people have never really stopped struggling since the first lockdown back in 2020. I think that it's been very difficult.
Obviously, being a small business owner, it's a struggle to find rising costs all the time. It's always something's got to give. 9 times out of 10, that's usually my wage that gives. I think if I equated the hours that I put into the business, I'd be way below minimum wage.
And the market used to be like a cozy place for Sheffield people and students. Not anymore. They don't find it really appealing. No matter you give offers, no matter you try to push your sales, they tell you frankly, we don't have the money. We like the stock, but we don't have the money. It's not good. And this is more market, the most popular place in Sheffield. If you don't make it here, you can't make it anywhere.
But what about politically? So what are we got these figures. We're in a technical recession, and then this is now obviously being used as a political football for everyone to kick around and say it's Rishi's recession. This is the problem. This is but what are solutions that we seeing at the moment?
Well, I think firstly on the whole Rishi's recession tagline, I think he's really brought that upon himself. Not just this last year, how things have gone, but remember this time last year, he made his 5 big pledges, and they were all centered around actually growing the economy. And I think not only has he failed in that, the exact opposite has happened. So, people might say he's not been the prime minister for I mean, it probably is quite a while now, 18 months or so. So people might feel like it's unjustified for his name to be attached to it in such a way, but he did promise the exact opposite of what's happened.
I'd like to bring in a clip actually of Professor Richard Murphy, who we spoke to earlier today. We'll have more of his interview later, but he spoke about austerity and particularly spoke about Labour's attitude to spending and this idea that there isn't any money left at the moment.
We are beginning to put names and identities to the consequences of austerity. Whereas, frankly, until 2019, we could say, yeah, local government's having a big problem in funding things, but we're not really seeing it. It's only in childcare, and most of us don't run across childcare services. It's a fairly niche area. Now it's everywhere. And yet the narrative remains, there is no money left. And it's complete nonsense. The money is there, it could be spent, and we have serious underemployment in the UK economy. Again, the OECD, it's not the OECD, it's the Office for National Statistics, produces data on employment, which they admit themselves is pretty ropey. I do a lot of work with a chap called Danny Blanchflower. Danny was once on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, where he caused lots of trouble. I choose my friends with care. We both sort of pursue this idea of the economics of walking about, actually seeing what's going on. And what we see are lots of people doing basically underemployment, working in call centres where they're not very productive, doing telesales for things that frankly nobody wants. And there are doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, God knows what else, actually working in any other section of the economy, but the one where they should be, where their skills could be best used, because it's claimed there's no money left. Complete nonsense. There is money, they could use it, but they aren't asking for it.
So Labour has said that Rishi is to blame for this current recession. But do you think that with the possibility, the very likely possibility, that Labour will be in government in the near future, do you think that they'll be able to turn this around, or do you think that there are some issues with their own economic policy and what Labour are planning to do, or what they've said that they're pledging to do?
Well, I think it's interesting, feeding into what our expert guest told us about, the Labour attitude at the moment, and about, not overspending or spending, like investing in a level that we've previously seen with different Labour governments. And I think that links to what our Shadow Chancellor for the Labour Party, Rachel Reeves, said following the recession about her idea of securenomics, so focusing on like stability and really monitoring investment quite tightly and not looking to spend our way out of this recession. And I think that really differs with the attitude that our guest thought we should take to getting out of this.
So what they're talking about there is a return to austerity,
yeah,
I guess, which worked so well last time.
Yeah, it is interesting what Rachel Reeves was saying about it's easy to look at this recession, the last 2 financial quarters, or just going back to COVID, 4 years ago. But Rachel Reeves said it's going to take a decade of national renewal to reverse what she describes as 14 years of Conservative failure. And I think that really puts into perspective how long Labour believe we've been on this road away from where we want to be, and how long the road, like it says a decade, that's like till 2034. I'll be quite old then. I don't really want to wait till then for things to turn around. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting for perspective wise. And also just on another Labour policy, so Deputy Leader Angela Rayner made the announcement last week of her real desire to improve the relationship between local and central government. I think in the last year, especially the last 2 years, we've seen like a complete breakdown in that, stemming back to Liz Truss's excellent 45 days or something in office that caused local councils to take out like massive loans with high interest rates in sort of a panic to meet their financial requirements, which has seen like big rises in council taxes that people just aren't prepared to pay. It gives people less money to spend, really. So I mean, Labour are looking to focus on that according to their deputy leader, and really have more of a role in auditing these local councils and giving them like longer funding plans so they can manage their funds better. I think last year 99% of local councils failed to submit their financial accounts on time or get them approved on time. And I think, you know, when that trickles down in council tax to everyone's affected by local government. So I think that's an area which which Labour may be able to help with the recession. But as we heard from Professor Richard Murphy, there are a lot of, you know, similarities in terms of the way they want to approach public spending and public investment.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of focus on growth with the GDP models and all the data, but we have a lot of focus in politics at the moment about not spending money. And it seems like, how are we going to get growth without some investment, and investment in the local councils, and investment like the green policy that we spoke about with our guest, that Labour obviously rode back on. So it is interesting to see what is out there for the future. Seems to be more austerity rather than something that people might want to bring us out of this. And I wanted to actually just to bring it back to the figures as well, to talk about how all of these measures that we have are lacking in, like, when we speak to people at the market, different small business owners, they are experiencing things that these measures don't show. And we spoke to our guest about this, and when these figures were actually devised, Simon Kuznets in 1934 was the person who devised these, and he warned that they shouldn't be used to measure the welfare of a nation. I'll bring Richard again in now, as he spoke really well on what GDP actually measures and whether we should have more holistic measures.
Look, we need to reappraise what it is that we think is really important. And material consumption, which is fundamentally what GDP measures, is, of course, also the best index of how fast we're burning the planet. And that's not really very helpful. So we need to actually think about all those other things. And when I'd refer you to a speech by Robert F. Kennedy, who was the younger brother of J.F. Kennedy, who was murdered in 1968, and I'm just young enough to actually, I'm old enough to remember that. I don't remember where I was when JFK was shot, but I know where I was when his brother was killed. And he made an amazing speech just before he was killed about GDP. And in that speech, he said, GDP measures everything that we don't value. It doesn't measure love. It doesn't measure our poetry. It doesn't measure the quality of our lives, our friendships, our environment, the nature around us, or anything else which is really important to our long-term well-being, and the quality of our lives. And so we need to actually think very seriously about what it is that we're really trying to achieve. And someday we need to stop this obsession with growth. I mean, when I was lecturing, I don't now, but I did, and I talked about GDP and growth, I always used to say, look, there's this amazing graph, and it starts off, there's the two axes, and it starts off down here, and it heads off up that way, somewhere up there, which is looks as though it's the northeast. So the ultimate answer to the ultimate question lies in Middlesbrough, because that's really where that graph was sort of pointing in the UK. Well, bonkers, mad, crazy. because much as Middlesbrough is worth going to, by the way, but it's not the answer to the ultimate question. We actually need to think about the economy, about living, about life, about government, about objectives in a holistic fashion. When we come up with holistic measures of well-being, we will then answer that question: what is a good life about in economic terms? Because it will be much broader and it will be political as well. And then we will get towards sensible measures. But at the moment, we don't even try to go near it.
I think that maybe a more holistic approach in general would be better, but again, it's hard to achieve. I think we kind of have this situation where it's sort of, what's the alternative? How do we measure in a better way, really? How do we look at things from a different perspective?
I know you went down to the Moor Market in Sheffield, David, and I just wanted to really see, like, how was it talking to people? I know we can hear their voices, but like being down in the atmosphere, like talking to people about their financial difficulties, basically. What are the people saying to you?
Yeah, I think it's not as simple as things point out that everything is bad. Like if we look at the data, we see that travel hotels has actually had a bit of a boost. And I spoke to a travel agent there who was like saying things aren't going great all the time, but still people are still traveling. There's still business there, and people are still out buying from the stores. It was still really busy. But then on the flip side of that, I had people telling me that they're having to cut corners, and one of the first things that they cut is their own wage. And so it is not a simple thing, like everybody is struggling, but it's still really hard. And I think I don't know if you feel this in your own personal lives, but like I had to move out of my last flat because the rent was raised and I couldn't afford it anymore. And it seems like all these pressures are impacting people on different levels. And in Manchester, the hospitality sector, where I'm from, has been hit really hard with how energy prices and the import-export charges and getting workers, paying workers enough because of the trade falling. And a lot of my favourite restaurants in Manchester just don't exist anymore because they've had to close.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, Joe, you were in touch with a restaurant, or you tried to get in touch with a restaurant in Sheffield that was suffering. So I don't know if you want to explain a bit more about that.
I would have loved to have been in touch with them. Unfortunately, they did not get in touch with me. That's fine. Busy people. There's a restaurant in Sheffield in Kelham Island. It's probably less than 15 minutes from where I live, called Duke and Low, run by two brothers, Luke and Joe Grayson. So you can wonder where they got the name from. But they're a Michelin recommended Sheffield restaurant, getting really good reviews in the Observer less than 2 years ago, and they've announced in the last week that they are closing down for good. They did put out a statement when they closed, and I thought it was quite interesting what they said. So I won't read it word for word, but they basically describe VAT as the dreaded VAT and being set at a preposterous percentage in an industry that can claim almost zero back. Racking our brains, we still don't know how this decimation of our industry began and is allowed to continue. I think it's interesting how damning that is. I mean, obviously they've lost their business through this, like really well respected business by the looks of the reviews. And I just think it's interesting how they describe the reason for the failure of the business as stemming from not from it being not a success, but from just being held back by so many costs in this era of like ever increasing prices. These businesses that are doing well are still not viable, and I think we see that on our doorstep here in Sheffield with this restaurant.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's not even about restaurants and shops that aren't getting good reviews, aren't selling good products, aren't serving good food. People want to go to these places, and I think the businesses clearly want to serve customers and they want to continue to grow, but it's just not possible. They're just being held back. So I think that's a really good point that you've raised there, Joe. We've already heard from Professor Richard Murphy throughout the podcast, but we're now going to listen to the full interview.
Hello, I'm Richard Murphy. I am Professor of Accounting Practice at the University of Sheffield. I am a chartered accountant, have been for 40 plus years now. I have been a senior partner of a firm of accountants, an entrepreneur, a finance director, chief executive and chairman of companies, a journalist, and for the last 20 odd years, I have been best known as a campaigner on economic and tax reform.
So what do you think the main takeaways should be from the recent economic announcements?
Well, look, whatever the recent economic announcements say, the reality has been that we have been in what has felt like a recession for some time. And in fact, if we look at the underlying data and never accept any data you're given by anyone at face value, that's most especially true of an economist, but frankly, pretty heavily true of an accountant as well. Because, of course, everybody puts their own spin on their data and it's produced in a certain way to impart a certain message. The ONS has produced data which is for a single GDP figure for the economy as a whole. But once we adjust that figure to take into account the fact that the population of the UK is growing, firstly, because actually more people are being born than dying, and secondly, because of migration, which is an issue which they've tried to sort of ignore by publishing the single figure non-population adjusted, it's apparent that we've been in recession for rather longer. In fact, maybe 7 quarters, nearly 2 years. And that's how it feels on the street. The GDP figure, which has suddenly created this headline, is a nonsense number which has gone into a negative, but it already was in reality negative, and that's how it felt on the ground. Secondly, do actually be really dubious about official statistics. Ask questions about how they're made up. GDP, for example, includes a completely notional number, which is nearly 10% of GDP, and therefore around £280 billion a year, which is made up of the rent that somebody like me, who owns their own house and is now old enough to not even have a mortgage, because yeah, that's the advantage of being 65, down nearly 66. I'm an old age pensioner next month, which is a slightly shocking reality I'm having to come to terms with. But when you own your own house, the ONS deem that you pay yourself rent for the right to live in it, which is completely ludicrous, because of course I don't pay myself rent for the right to live in my own house. If I did, it would be money coming out of my bank account and going back into my bank account. But 1/10 of UK GDP is based upon that number and is related to the value of rents. So sometimes GDP goes up because they deem that the price of rents has gone up and therefore I'm paying myself more to live in my own home and nothing has happened. Why are we in the situation we're in is the more interesting question, I guess, and how, of course, do we get out of it? And on this, I will repeat something that I said to a newspaper last week. I mean, we've got a recession engineered by Rishi Sunak, the Bank of England, and the Treasury, which was designed to happen. You can't do austerity for 14 years and not eventually end up with a recession. You can't increase interest rates from 0.25% to 5.25% and not end up with a recession, particularly when we never needed to increase interest rates to beat inflation, because the inflation we had wasn't of the sort that interest rate rises can deal with, because it happened because of price rises in China and because of war in Ukraine. And believe it or not, neither of those are heavily influenced by the interest rate that is charged by the Bank of England in the UK. So therefore, those interest rate increases had no impact, but they were intended to reduce demand in the UK, and they have. And so what we've got is exactly what they wanted. Nor can we get a recession if the government doesn't invest, and the track record of government investment in the UK is dire. I mean, in net terms, we're almost disinvesting at the moment. And we're seeing no sign of either the Conservatives or Labour wishing to change that. They both believe that tax cuts make a difference. Tax cuts do not, have not, and never will boost an economy, because the benefit of most tax cuts goes to the people who pay most tax, and they're the wealthiest. And the wealthiest are wealthy because they can save or have saved. And therefore, if you give them more money by a tax cut, they save more, and money saved is not spent into the economy and therefore doesn't boost growth. The only person who isn't responsible for it is Liz Truss, rather bizarrely. And I really don't want to defend Liz Truss, because she's completely mad in economic and political terms, in my opinion, and her advisor, Mark Littlewood. Liz Truss did not create a major recession in 2022. The Bank of England did. The Bank of England under Andrew Bailey and the Treasury, with its deeply conventional view of the need for austerity, are the cause of the current recession we have and the downturn that we face. And unless we see a significant change in policy, then it's going to carry on.
And is there any hope for the future, you think, with the likelihood of the outcome? We're probably going to have a Labour government, but are either parties saying anything or doing anything that should give us any kind of hope, in your opinion?
Well, I'd love to say there was hope. I mean, I always live in hope. I'm an optimist. That's how I'm still surviving, still working. No intention of retiring. My nominated retirement age is 83 at the moment, so I've got a long time to go. Why do I have hope? Because change is always possible. At the moment, change doesn't look very likely, I've got to admit. The Tories, let's be honest, they're not going to be in office whatever happens. They have completely bust themselves. And appropriately, they need to be thrown out of office. They have no idea what to do, and their talent pool is completely empty. And that happens to governments after 14 years of office of any persuasion. But Labour is pretty desperate, if I'm honest. Why do I think Labour is pretty desperate? By the way, I'm not much kinder about the Liberal Democrats, the SNP. The Greens need to sort out some aspects of their economic policy before it makes any sense. I think Plaid Cymru is probably okay, but I don't think anybody's thinking they're going to be close to power, even in Wales right now. What's going on here is the persistent acceptance of the narrative of neoliberalism for a faith, cult, creed. It's because after all, it's not a science. It's most definitely not science of neoliberal economics, which claims its belief in the market. It's completely killed the alternative forms of thinking to that one now dominant narrative that they have maintained. And that is what is denying us hope, because they all believe that government has to be constrained in size to provide a private sector with opportunity, when it's perfectly clear that, frankly, if Apple didn't produce another iPhone for another 5 years, the world wouldn't end. We don't need so much of what the private sector is doing at the moment. We do desperately need what the state sector is doing. And we have all our major political parties believing that they're constrained by a lack of money, because they don't understand that money is created by government spending and destroyed by taxation and borrowing, just as they don't understand that private banks create money by lending and destroy it by loan repayment, which is, by the way, how banks do literally make and destroy money.
And is there any policy that you would say this is in the right direction? For example, the green policy that's just been rowed back on by Labour. Is there any policy that you would champion now? Obviously, you want to change the narrative, you want to change how economics is thought of, but is there anything now that people are talking about that you think this is a start?
I created something called the Green New Deal. It was first written in 2007-8, published in July 2008, before Lehman Brothers went bust. Had quite a big influence when it first came out. Some chap called Barack Obama was using it by October 2008 as part of his presidential campaign in the USA. Literally based upon what 8 people sitting in somebody's flat in London eating Chinese takeaways and writing some economics had put together that summer. So I sort of have some roots and history in that plan, and know people who were very heavily involved in promoting it. And it needs to be done. The only thing I can say about the 28 billion was it was far too small. We can show that the figure should be very much higher, and the total spend level required to deal with all the shortfalls in climate change, social investment, school investment, social housing investment, and then in social care investment and all the support services could be up to 200 trillion a year. Now, that's in an economy which is 2.8 trillion. So 200 billion, I hope I said not 200 billion. Yeah, 200 billion is what we need to spend. So, a relatively small part, perhaps 7-8% of the economy needs to be spent. And I believe the resources could be found to do that. And secondly, so we need to have an ambitious program of government spending to transform the economy, which would absolutely give hope and employment and wealth and extra tax revenues. But if we need extra tax revenues, then the other thing I'm working on is something called the Taxing Wealth Report. And what I show is that if wealth in the UK is drastically undertaxed, if the increase in wealth between 2011 and 2019, which was sort of the relatively clean data years between the financial crash of 2008 and before we hit COVID, were taxed at the same rate as income had been taxed over that period, as reflected in GDP, then an extra 170 billion of tax a year should have been collected. Wealth has been growing exponentially, largely because it's been undertaxed.
So what's next? We've looked at all this data, and it can be really easy sometimes to catastrophise and to overthink things and to worry too much about what's to come. But there are solutions, and there are people working on these solutions. we don't know them yet. It's not very clear, but I think in time, and especially if we do have a new government, which it's probably going to happen, there's probably going to be a new party in charge, and anything could happen. As we've seen, nothing is that predictable, even if we try to. So it's important to kind of have hope and keep looking forward, and it's not all doom and gloom. And hopefully we've allayed some of your fears in this podcast.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Me either.
So thank you for listening to Money Matters. And tune in to future Sheffield Wire episodes where I'm sure people will be discussing a range of topics on a range of things.
The happy music's back.
Yeah,
Let's
love
go.
it.